Hello and welcome to the New Era podcast. My name is Jeff Peel. Ben Habib is leader of the Advance Party in the United Kingdom. Membership of the party has grown markedly because of the endorsement of Elon Musk, who also proclaimed Nigel Farage as no longer fit for purpose. I asked Ben to tell me why he was so keen to get the support of Musk and Musk's brand of MAGA. Um, you're probably a little bit aware of what the new era is about. I created the site just really at the end of December 2020 because we had gone into the second round of lockdown at that stage. And I and many other people started to get the feeling that we were being very fundamentally manipulated by the media, particularly the mainstream media. Do you get that same feeling that there was a new era that started around uh, March 2020?
I think it's a wave that has been building for decades, and lockdowns and the extreme measures used by government to so-called combat the virus, I think just revealed what was really a direction of travel that had been unfolding over many decades. And I I'm of the view that we are now being governed under what I call extreme ideologies, ideological governance without any common sense, and certainly without any um, foundation in protecting this country, its people, and promoting our interests. There are ideologies which have gripped those that govern us, including the mainstream media and the commentariat more generally, out of which they can't escape. Some people call it woke. Woke is one way to describe it, but it's effectively, in my mind, this kind of belief system that doesn't recognize nation states, that puts a protective blanket round the entire world. So citizens of a particular country effectively get set aside, promotes extreme energy policies like net zero and so on. And also, when it comes to the populace, an extremely controlling state, um, which was evident so clearly in the way you just described, Jeff, when they locked us down.
Yeah.
And for me, it was a wake up call too, because I was absolutely stunned, by the way, when we were locked down. I remember um, only as a child, but the 1968 virus, I can't remember the name of it now, but I do remember there was an epidemic in 1968. And the view I've always had with illness is illness will do what illness does.
Mm.
And you need to protect yourself, keep yourself as well protected as you possibly can, healthy, etc. And I thought we'd never lock down. When I saw China lock down, I thought, well, that's what China may do. We're not China. And but then we did lock down. We took our lead from a totalitarian regime. And
Mm.
then Ofcom was informed, which is what I think you're referring to. Ofcom was effectively informed that they must not allow any alternative views to reveal themselves or reveal the idiocy of what was happening through the media. And you might recall the Great Barrington Declaration. Do you remember the
Yeah, yeah.
Great Barrington Declaration, which was 4,000 leading epidemiologists and scientists from across the globe who came together and said lockdown is a wrong response?
Mm.
And people like, what was the name of the health secretary then, whose name now escapes me?
Matt
What was his
Hancock.
name? Yeah, Matt Hancock. He got up in Parliament and said the Great Barrington Declaration is nonsense. you
Mm.
know, yeah. So I think we're heading in that direction, and we're seeing now freedom of speech, not being assaulted repeatedly, aren't we? It's under
Yeah, but
perpetual assault.
I think it's more fundamental than that because clearly there was a huge amount of manipulation. I recently interviewed Piers Robinson, an academic who has really focused on the use of propaganda as a weapon against citizens, ordinary citizens, and he refers to the COVID event as a sort of a deep, a strategic deep event. In other words, one that resulted in fundamental changes in society,
Yeah.
and that propaganda event resulted in really a loss of the free media, and we still haven't recovered it. It means that alternative media have been developed really to counter the fact that we no longer have journalism really as a profession
Well,
on
that's for sure.
mainstream media.
I
Um,
endorse that completely. Yeah.
but it does mean, of course, that we need to question the key actors in the media landscape. Now I know that Twitter at the time was not owned by Elon Musk, but there was a number of media organizations that became all controlling in terms of censorship during that period, and clearly were acting in cahoots with government. The BBC, for example, created the Trusted News Initiative in conjunction with YouTube and with Facebook and Twitter, and shut down any ability for ordinary individuals to take a dissenting view. And of course, Musk then acquires Twitter and says that he's going to make fundamental changes. But they're all of the tech bros at the Trump inauguration were there at the inauguration, corralled and of course lauded because they were so instrumental in the successful election of Trump. Do you think that we're still being manipulated, though, that really all they've done is put some MAGA baubles over the media industry, but really they're doing the same thing?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that the mainstream media is hijacked. I think there is an infection in mainstream media. Anything that is certainly subject to Ofcom regulations in this country it's incapable of doing the right thing. And that there's now, I think, a further assault through the Online Harms or Online Safety Act, which is ostensibly for the protection of children, and obviously children need to be protected, though I think my own view is that should be done through the family rather than through regulations, and we can discuss that separately.
Mm.
But there's an increasing creep of the state into the way we think, the way we articulate ourselves, to the point. I know this is not quite the point you're making because you're talking about manipulation, aren't you? But I think you can manipulate. You can only really manipulate if you shut down free speech. They go hand in hand, and the way that they arrested that what's his name, Graham Linehan, for
Hmm.
tweeting that quip that he's a comedian, isn't he? That quip about what you do if you confronted by a transgender woman in a toilet, if they won't leave, punch them in the balls, and that landed him. Effectively in prison, or he's being charged with it and now has to defend himself. So we live in some kind of dystopia when it comes to the exchange of information. And it is sad because I think that in the past, certainly I did, maybe we were all being brainwashed and we never woke up to it. But in the when I was growing up as a young man, and I just believed the BBC. I believed everything I heard on the BBC. I
Hmm.
thought they were purveyors of truth, and I think they probably were. I still think that, and I think there's been an infection since.
Yeah. But on the Graham Linehan story, it's an interesting case in point. Clearly, the agenda was focused on trans. Honestly, do you think the trans agenda is that important for most members of the British public? But this, of course, is identified even by Farage. Who troops off to the Congress and gives evidence to Congress and refers to the Graham Linehan incident. But of course, the United States is facing what a total government debt pile, a federal debt pile of $40 trillion. There's clearly a cost of living crisis. We have a genocide happening in Gaza. We have proxy wars happening in Ukraine. And yet the sole focus of the media seems to be on Graham Linehan. There is something fundamentally wrong that we're being given these straw men, and we're being media manipulated to focus on stuff that really, in the scheme of things, is not at all important.
Well, I don't agree with that, actually, Jeff. I mean, I think it's the Graham Linehan story reflects a deeper malaise of what's going on in our country. Why the hell was he arrested? And now I understand the other point you're making, which is it's a distraction from the 40 trillion debt level and you know, more fundamentally important things. But they, you know, none of these things ever happen in isolation. There tends to be a relationship between all the different things that you see happening around you. And the challenge, I think, for those of us who are not part of creating this collage of misery is identifying the dots, joining the lines, and trying to understand how it is we got to where we are. What are the root causes of these issues? And they're often linked. I mean, you talked about the 40 trillion debt level, and we talked about Graham Linehan. And of course, they're linked too. Because what the $40 trillion debt level evidence is a state that is um, m- m- trying to have influence, massive influence in its own country. And the reason it's got that debt level is because it needed that cash to have the influence it wants. Whatever it was spending that money on gained it influence. And what we should want, I think, in my own mind at least, is a minimal state. And with a minimal state comes lesser borrowing, less need for the state to have cash to tax us and borrow and spend and so on, because it's not spending, it's not trying to manipulate us. And manipulate us in a more sort of tangible way than free speech. But of course, free speech is one way to manipulate. And if you're going to perpetrate, for example, what I call these extreme ideologies like net zero, emasculating your economy on the back of, supposed risk to the world as a result of climate change, even though we don't have the technologies available already to replace fossil fuel. If you're going to do things like that are damaging to the British people, then you've got to control what the British people are allowed to say because they would otherwise rise up. You know, there's a reason why we call it the silent majority because they've effectively been sat on. And the transgender ideology debate, as distracting as one might think it is, because only 0.4% of the population identify as being another sex, it's part of this greater move towards discombobulating us. You know, it's embedded in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which informs us that for some reason, which is not clear to me, ethnic minorities, uh, people who have, minority religious beliefs, identify as women, so they deserve a protected blanket, that they should be celebrated in society. And it's part of this complete crazy form of governance that we're now experiencing. So I would say there's a direct link between the national debt level of the United States and indeed the United Kingdom and the extreme form of policies that we're practicing and including the shutting down of free speech and the controlling of what we can and can't say.
Yeah, but why does Trump, for example, not overtly refer to escalating federal debt? He never refers to it.
Well, I
Why
think they
is it?
set up Doge, didn't they, to
Why?
try and tackle the debt?
Yeah, yes, but it was fiddling around the edges, and of course, then Elon Musk threw in the towel and resigned from that particular role.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the American national debt is a really particularly interesting thing to discuss because, and I'm sure you'll remember this, Kissinger said it's our currency, but it's your problem. And
Mm,
America's national debt, I think, affects the rest of the world in a way that no country's national debt does. And America has this great benefit, which none of us do, at least at the moment, that frankly it can do whatever it wants. There's not much we can do about it. It can allow its debt to grow. Its currency may weaken, but everyone has to hold dollars. That's the international currency. And so it will fund its position. It'll print if it has to fund its position. The UK doesn't have that luxury, and I think I think we're on the point of a Minsky moment, if you know what I mean, where the
mm.
markets may just suddenly turn on sterling and turn on British government debt because it is so clearly out of control. And we can't, sterling is our currency and it's our problem. We can't assume people are going to buy British government bonds. And I think we're in a really difficult place where if sterling starts collapsing and interest rates go up and the government can't fund itself, interest rates go further up, sterling further collapses, and we end up in a very deep recession. And that too, I think, is the result of 30 years, I would say 30 odd years of really bad governance of the United Kingdom.
So yeah, and in fact, it is very topical at the minute. We've seen 30-year gilt yields going up to what, 5.7%.
Yeah.
I think
And they turfed
higher.
Truss out when they went to 4.5%. Do you
Yeah, but
remember?
it
Yeah,
has been, and of course, Truss was also in a government that was spending hand over fist. You know, there are,
true.
I think the Labour government, you know, the fiscal deficit this year is what, 130, 140 billion, 300 billion in 2020.
Oh,
And
yeah.
no one ever said, "Oh, do you not think that perhaps the appropriate response to a mild respiratory disease may involve something rather less expensive than an increase of our public debt by 300 billion pounds?"
Yeah. I
No,
think as a
but
result of
nobody on the
uh,
right. There was total consensus that the policy response to COVID was appropriate. Who spoke
not
out on
from,
the right?
well, I don't know what you mean by the right. I don't see politics in left and right, but I spoke out about it a lot back in 2020 that we
You
shouldn't.
did.
Yeah.
Did Farage?
Well, Farage is very peculiar. I'm sick of talking about Farage, if you don't mind me
Yeah.
saying so. But Farage was very peculiar in the COVID years. Farage is a very peculiar person. But initially, he was saying we didn't lock down fast enough. We should have locked down earlier. Look at Milan. Look at all the problems. We were letting in flights from China. I remember him banging the drum, getting all upset about that. And then he said that lockdowns had gone on too long and that we must get on with vaccination and that we must bring Tony Blair back. I mean, I think
Mm.
Tony Blair is the devil in the damage that he's done to our country. I think he laid the framework, the foundations of all the issues that you and I have just been discussing. In my mind, they start with Tony Blair. And he wanted Tony Blair back to come and roll the vaccine out. Um, but you know, you make a really good point, and I'm going to go back to it. The policy of lockdown was extreme. That was government intervention on steroids, locking us down. And and with that massive government intervention came massive debt. And the more they intervene in our lives, the more debt they're going to have. And this is what they haven't woken up to. People, in many respects now, they've taken what we used to call the nanny state, and I call it, I now term it the wet nurse. We've got a wet nurse, basically. And we've dulled down personal agency in our populace. We have turned wealth creation into wealth redistribution. We've turned aspiration into dependency. We've got 7.7 million people now in universal credit, 3 million people not even looking for a job. You know, we've absolutely destroyed ourselves on the back of things like lockdown and all the subsequent policies that have followed. And all of that will result in bad economic outcomes. And people often don't understand that. Even during lockdown, they said, oh my God, you can't talk about having to save the economy versus save someone's life is much more important than the economy. But of course, if you don't protect the economy, we all suffer massive health implications for an economy that's in trouble. And we saw that. We saw waiting lists for the NHS. I think they went up, the waiting list went from 14 weeks, from 7 weeks waiting list to 14 weeks, from 3 million people to 8 million people waiting to be seen. I can't remember exactly what the stats are now, but I think I've roughly got them right. It was a complete disaster at every single level. And so, what we've got to do as a country, and I think Western civilization more generally, Europe, US, they've been practicing the same policies as we have, is go back and unwind this mollycoddling state. The state has to be, we have to take an axe to the state and we have to empower the people. The people need to have the ability to run their own lives.
I totally agree with you on that. However, I think that the discourse, the discussion around escalating debt, and really the source of that escalating debt in recent times coming from the COVID event, isn't really in popular discourse at all. You know, it is
Yeah,
not permitted on mainstream media. And you know, I take the point you were making about trusts, and of course the redeeming feature of Truss was that at least she was elected by the membership of the Conservative Party. She wasn't. She was obviously dragged
yeah,
down when she tried to, you know, establish her own policy agenda. But at least she was elected. But it does indicate that there is a kind of deep state at work, particularly within the Uni Party, that ensures that the narrative, the discussion will always stay on the rails. Anytime a
I
maverick gets
agree.
involved, they are not
Absolutely.
permitted to speak.
100%. I mean, she was taken down by people in her own party, but she was also taken down by the Bank of England. They absolutely hung her out to dry. Andrew Bailey was part of the problem. And so that's one of the reasons I reject left and right. I mean, I think we're living in a world where you have a certain set of beliefs, and I call them the kind of liberal global order, of which the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are members, who don't recognize they don't recognize whatever the Conservative Party might say. They don't have small c conservative DNA anymore. They don't recognize the importance of nation states, the promotion of individual rights, genuine individual rights, as opposed to extreme ideologies shutting us down and making us believe things that are patently untrue. Um, they don't believe in any of that. They believe in massive control, massive government intervention, the infantilizing of the populace, feeding us what we need to think, indoctrinating our children, telling us, for example, if you're white, that you've got privilege, and if you don't recognize that privilege, you're a racist, rewriting our history, hijacking the English language so that we can't understand, what is right and what's wrong. And that's that group. That's the uniparty group. And Farage is actually pretty much in that group. He doesn't really have a political philosophy or compass that guides him. And then there are those of us who really firmly believe in our nation state sovereignty. I believe in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and all its parts and all its people, freedom of speech, freedom of action, freedom of thought, so that our children are not being indoctrinated, in democracy, getting rid of supranational influences in our in our country, in our domestic affairs, getting rid of the bureaucracy, which we've discussed, Ofcom and Elcom and OBR and all those kinds of people that prohibit us from actually doing as politicians what the people wish them to do. Now, politicians used to famously blame the EU when things went wrong. Well, where's the EU? It's not us, it's the EU. And now they say it's the civil service or it's the Lords. There's always a boogeyman,
Mm.
and we've got to get rid of all of that nonsense. And we've got to start governing for the interests of the country and its people. And amongst all of that, of course, we've also got two-tier justice. And that too is bound to have occurred if the government practices extreme ideologies in the way that it has been. So I
Mm.
think we're in a really bad place, Jeff. I assume we agree on that.
Yeah, we do. I'd like to take you back though to January and Farage. I'm sorry for mentioning him again, but really
No.
it's really just to understand the context. So we had Farage at Mar-a-Lago, and essentially the all of the events following the inauguration, and he was lauded, I think, by MAGA and MAGA 2.0. But then Musk sort of threw all his toys out of the pram and said, "Oh no, I really don't like him anymore. He's not the man for the job." And suddenly, you were identified as the potential salvation, and I think you indicated in the previous interview I watched that you had a 20-minute conversation with Elon Musk. How did that all come about? How was it that you were the chosen one,
I
the
don't know if I'm the
salvation?
chosen one. I think that's a. Yeah, I don't know if I'm the chosen one. No, it came about. So Musk denouncing Farage happened before Mar-a-Lago, before the inauguration, which I think was towards the end of January. It was the beginning of January that Musk came out and said Farage isn't up to the job. But I think the fundamental, you'd have to ask Elon Musk why he denounced Farage. But I think the breaking point, I mean, there's lots of, if you observe Farage carefully, and even not that carefully, there are lots of self-contradictory things going on with Farage. You realize very quickly this man doesn't know whether he's coming or going. But I think the trigger point for Elon Musk was Farage saying, uh, Elon Musk saying that Tommy Robinson was a political prisoner, and Farage saying, no, he's not a political prisoner. He was in contempt of court. He's in contempt of court because he breached the injunction, and he deserves to be in prison. And I will explain it to Elon Musk when I meet him. And I then did a little post on X in which I explained why technically there's no way you can conclude anything other than Tommy Robinson is a political prisoner. And Elon Musk obviously saw my post. And he then started following me and, tweeted a few other things that I'd posted and so on, reposted some of the things I'd done. And then we got closer and he observed the, things I believe in and what I say and so on. And we got closer as a result of that.
But do you not think that, that it's probably the most influential, most powerful person on earth suddenly tweeting about Tommy Robinson, the sort of minutiae of British politics, is somewhat odd. And also, he sort of elbowed into the issue of the grooming gangs. The grooming gang issue was clearly a national scandal, and the way it was investigated was utterly disgraceful.
Yeah.
But he elbowed into that discussion and suddenly put it back on the agenda. I think the scandal sort of broke in the early 19 or the grooming gang issue broke in the 1990s, sort of was wound up legally in 2013. But so we're talking about a period in British history over 20 years ago. But suddenly Elon Musk brought it back onto the, right at the front of the whole policy agenda for the United Kingdom and the issue of a public inquiry. Why did that happen? What was the
Yeah. I
germination
think
for that?
there is still some gang rapes going on. It may not be as bad as it was, but it is still going on. And I think, again, I think if you look at all the dots on a page, there you'll see that the grooming gangs didn't happen in isolation. Again, it's part of this reluctance, I think, to put it very simply, a reluctance of the British establishment to call out any ethnic minority for fear of being accused of being racist. And it goes back to the hijacking of our being able to think straight. You know, and I mentioned, critical race theory earlier, where, if you're white and you don't recognize that you're privileged, you're basically a racist. And white people have been shamed in their own countries to take a back seat, and ethnic minorities have been brought in, celebrated, their culture celebrated, protected blankets put around them. And in many ways, we've set aside the existence of our country in the pursuit of that kind of ideology. But one of the consequences of that kind of approach to governance has been that people from ethnic minorities committing crime were protected. And the grooming gangs were perhaps the worst example, but no doubt the worst example in the last few years, last decades
But
of
we did have an investigation, a public investigation into institutional abuse of children in, for example, the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. That's not to say that every Anglican is a potential paedophile,
no, but I think we
nor
live
is
in a
every
world.
Pakistani.
No, absolutely. And in fact, I'm half Pakistani and I have spoken to Pakistan. But let me tell you, child abuse is taken very, very seriously in Pakistan. Until 2018, you'd be hanged if you were found having assaulted a child, like any one of those gang rape, rapists did. And I'm in touch with a number of people very high level in Pakistan law enforcement who actually say to me that it's England's fault. It's the United Kingdom's fault. It's because there is, in fact, a treaty between the United Kingdom and Pakistan, a prisoner transfer treaty, which would allow the United Kingdom to deport these people who commit crimes in the United Kingdom, but they're not deported because of the European Convention of Human Rights, because they'd be treated in the way that criminals should frankly be treated in Pakistan. And he says it's an absolute absurdity, and perhaps this is another very good example of the extreme ideologies pursuant to which we're governed. He says he pointed out to me it's absolutely absurd that as a result of your kind of uber liberal approach to life in the United Kingdom now, you protect criminals. You've set aside the need to protect victims. You set aside victims' rights, and you've afforded the criminal all the protection. And when I challenged him on Pakistani rape gangs and so on, he said, we send them back. We would absolutely deal with them ruthlessly. They're barbarians, these people. But it's
Mm.
the problem lies in your system. because it's your system, in other words, our system, the British system, that is incapable of dealing with it properly. And he made a very, very powerful set of points. And it goes back again to many of the things, they're all related, aren't they? And so I think Elon Musk could see that. In the 20-minute conversation I had with him, one of the we really connected on one point, and it was this, that Western civilization is threatened at the moment. We could see an end to Western civilization, and all the things like grooming
But
gangs.
is one of the threats
Yeah,
surely not dividing and othering people? Certainly the grooming gang issue was an extraordinarily important issue, and I agree with much of what you've
yeah,
just said. But it was the fact that Elon Musk weighed in on it almost out of the blue. We weren't really, and it did feel like it was about a foreigner intervening in UK politics and attempting to other and to blame and to indicate cause of division in our societies, which he didn't really have any knowledge of. And I think we know that Elon Musk doesn't really speak as an individual. There's a huge infrastructure behind him. No man, no single person could run the companies that he
well, let me just
supposedly
tell you,
runs.
he does all his own posts on X. and
Well, that
and
may
I
be only what he does, though, isn't it?
well, I don't know. I mean, look, you don't get to be the richest man in the world by, I think he's super driven, super capable. He had a really good grasp of the various things that you and I've just been to see. He had a really good grasp of it. In 20 minutes, we covered a lot of ground. And no, I think it would be risky and wrong to assume there's some kind of machine behind Elon Musk and it's not Elon Musk. I think when Elon Musk says something, I think that is Elon Musk speaking. Um,
But
but
just on that point, though,
yeah,
I wrote a post on the New Era a week or so ago about specifically about reform and about Farage's proximity to the so-called PayPal mafia, particularly Peter Thiel. And we know, for example, that JD Vance is a protege of Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is the man behind Palantir, which is attempting to introduce digital ID systems into the United Kingdom, probably by the back door through the NHS. And I wrote the piece indicating that Farage had an unhealthy relationship with the so-called PayPal mafia, or the technocrats as they're being called. But we know that Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are joined at the hip. We know that they come from a similar political ideology where they believe that a monolithic technical infrastructure should be used to govern probably the world, but certainly individual nation states. Palantir is intimately involved in the rollout of the digital ID systems in Israel, for example, for mass surveillance activities in Gaza, the targeting of missiles in the Israeli attacks on Gaza. We are potentially sleeping with the devil, I think, if we work very closely with these technocrats. And maybe Musk was doing more of a predictor when he said that we might see the collapse of certain Western nations because his technology is actively involved in it. His and Peter Thiel's.
well, I don't recognize any of that in what I've seen of his pronunciations. I could, of course, be wrong, but I don't recognize it. I see the discussion we had was one where he was lamenting the fact that the United Kingdom was in such trouble, that it was being so threatened, that he had a great affiliation and liking and wanted to protect the United Kingdom. And I think that applies right across the Trump administration. And it doesn't surprise me, a desire to protect the UK and to try and restore it to its former stable, glorious position that it used to have, because it's a feeling that I know many, many people in many, many countries have. People used to look at the UK and get real succor and solace from our existence. Perhaps that's um, alien to others who are not so UK disposed, but that there are, billions of people who I think are very who are Anglophiles, and I think he's one of them.
You think?
I do. I mean, maybe I'm naive and wrong, but that's what I think, Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we disagree on that. I just recently published a novel, and the in fact the novel was named after the location of Twitter's headquarters in South of Market in San Francisco, an area now defined by fentanyl addiction and depravity and the loss of a once great city. And I think Twitter, and frankly, I don't see any difference between Twitter and X. I think Twitter is actively involved in the creation of social division and othering. And when he appointed
What
Linda
do you mean
Yacob,
by othering? It's a
well,
term I don't like, if you
the,
don't mind me
the
saying
the
so.
the identification of certain groups
Yeah.
that have characteristics that, frankly, they have no control over. You can't determine whether you're going to be born white or black, but the identification of certain people in societies as being the cause of social breakdown in some way. And I think I would specifically mention, the identification of people from Islamic nations as being responsible for social destruction, I think is extraordinarily inappropriate. I grew up in Northern Ireland, where from the moment of birth you were defined as Protestant or Catholic, Unionist or Nationalist, and from the moment I was sort of had the ability to look around me and see what was going on, I chose not to be identified in those particular ways. I'm sure you wouldn't necessarily want to be identified as simply Pakistani or white or whatever. You obviously want to be seen to be somebody who is thinking and sentient, and can take people as they find them rather than in the ways that you're told
Yeah.
to
So,
find
I mean, I
them.
think there are a number of things that you're touching on. The first is, your immutable physical characteristics, which we obviously can't change. Um, but then you also mentioned Islam, and Islam is just like any other ideology. It's just an ideology. And I was born in Pakistan, so I'm familiar with, I lived there till I was 13. My dad's Pakistani. I went back quite a lot. And Islam does present challenges, I think. It's not the immutable characteristics of the people that practice Islam that's at issue. I think Islam is a religion that poses challenges for the very delicate form of democracy that we practice in the UK, particularly a democracy which is now infected with what I would call extreme liberalism, with DEI and this protective blanket that's put around minority religious beliefs, including Islam. Islam is a muscular religion. So let me just say, Islam over the centuries, and I'm sure you know as well as I do, if not better, has oscillated. It's gone from being quite fundamentalist, quite proselytizing, expansionist, to then rowing back, and then it's come forward and it's rowing back. But it has a tendency, in my mind, to be muscular and to be unforgiving because its essence is that the Quran is the word of God and it's perfect and it's unchallengeable. So debate doesn't really happen in Islam. Now, when I was a child, Islam was going through quite an enlightened period in Pakistan. It had taken a backseat as far as governance was concerned, and you could drink freely in Pakistan. We were brought up swimming, and my sister would wear bikinis, etc., etc. But then Wahhabi Islam, or more fundamentalist form of Islam, took root, I think deliberately exported by the Saudis back in the 80s. And the form of Islam that we've got in the UK is a Wahhabi form of fundamentalist Islam. Farage will call out extremist Islam as being a problem. Any form of extremism is a problem. But I think one of the issues with Islam is that unless you're part of the enlightened um, uh, Muslim group, which is permanently under pressure from the fundamentalists. Actually, the fundamentalists are an issue. And I think we've got to be brave enough to call that out in the UK. I think it's very, very wrong that Parliament is considering bringing in a law to ban Islamophobia, which by definition is a hijacking. It's a using of language to shut down debate because phobia, as you know, is an irrational fear of something. And Islamophobia, if you suffer from Islamophobia, if you're accused of suffering from Islamophobia, basically you're being accused of being irrational. And that is trying to prohibit you from challenging Islam. We should be able to challenge Islam. We challenge Christianity all the time. I mean, goodness knows you're from Northern Ireland. You know that there was quite a few challenges posed by the Protestants to the Catholics and vice versa, even though a lot of Catholics are unionist. So, I mean, I think but Islam, I think, does pose challenges to the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and again, I would agree. I think certain people practice their Islam in ways that they could be described perhaps as menu Muslims, as just as New York Jews are
Yeah,
menu
like
Jews.
my father, he would drink, and he used to drink very openly and very happily, and he used to prohibit us as children. I remember when we were children, he'd prohibit us from telling him that spare ribs were actually pork because he just loved eating them so much. So So I'd say, Daddy, you know that is pork, and he'd go, No, 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 don't say that. Do not say that.
Well, listen, tell me a little bit more about the party.
Yeah,
Obviously, you have benefited from the fact that you have had the endorsement of Elon Musk, and that's been quite fortunate. He's got the biggest uh, Twitter presence of any individual. So you're now approaching 30,000 members, I believe, and you're planning to register with the Electoral Commission. So,
correct.
what are your ambitions, and perhaps you could tell me again about how you delineate um, advance from reform? Because one of the difficulties I have is to understand how you differ from the Reform Party in terms of your
We
sort
differ entirely from reform.
of. Well, you would not. To be fair, Ben, you were a member of Reform, and you did
Yeah,
contest the election as a Reform candidate.
absolutely. Absolutely right. Right, where do I start? Let me just tell you about Advance, first of all. Advance um, is a democratic party. Anyone can join Advance. Anyone who's on a British citizen and on the electoral roll, as long as they're not a member of another party, can join Advance. Very open. And that's not the case with Reform. If you wish to join Reform and you've said something on Twitter or something that you regret or they regret, they turf you out of the party instantly. So that's one difference. Um, the other difference is we are democratic. We have our membership can remove the leader by a simple majority at any time. You can't do that with Reform. Farage is Reform and Reform is Farage, and he has a tight grip over the governance of the party. Indeed, it's effectively controlled by him and Zair Yusuf. So that's another difference. But I think the fundamental difference between Reform and Advance is that Reform doesn't have a political philosophy. Yes, we think of the persona of Nigel Farage as being a nationalist. He wears union flag socks and he bangs the drum against immigration and so on. But actually, if you look not so closely, you don't have to look that close, you look a little closely at what he says, and it goes from one position to another position, depending on who he's speaking to, where he is, and who he's trying to curry favor with. And so, for example, many years ago, he said, under no circumstances should Shamima Begum come back. And now he's prepared to countenance circumstances in which we should contemplate her being repatriated to the United Kingdom. At one level, he bangs on about Islam posing challenges. At another level, he says you can't politically alienate Islam, whatever that means. He talks about the need to protect our culture, but he's not worried about demographic change. And so on and so forth. He is a conundrum. He talks about ditching DEI, but then the other day was prepared to put men who identify as women into women's prisons. You can't, the whole thing about DEI. It's only through DEI that that kind of nonsense is allowed. So Farage is a conundrum, and because Farage is Reform and Reform is a Farage, Reform is a conundrum. We don't know what it is. What I do know is that he's a deeply difficult individual. And I think if he were to become prime minister, it would be very, very damaging to the United Kingdom. And the way we differ from Farage in this fundamental way is that we have a mission statement, which is our political philosophy, and you can go and read it. I can run you through it if you like. But it is the framework around which all our policies will be built, and we will have a ready answer pretty much for any issue that faces us, even issues with which we're not familiar, because we have a foundational set of beliefs which will guide us in our policy creation and what needs to be done. And our basic mission statement is a belief in the nation state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in all its parts and for all its people, our Christian constitution, as distinct actually from our Christian culture. One comes from the other, but our reinforcing our Christian constitution, a belief in freedom, freedom of action, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, a rejection of indoctrination, a belief in democracy and the ejection of supranational influence in our country, and and removing the bureaucratic class from the enormous power that they hold in the United Kingdom, and finally equality under the law. And these things, as basic and fundamental as you might see them and say, well, there's nothing remarkable in them. Actually, those four things that I've expressed are not really practiced by any of the main parties. None of them are. You talked about the Uniparty. I mean, they don't practice any of this. Farage doesn't practice any of this. And so you also asked me, and I'll come back to now answering your question, what do you hope to achieve? What I hope to achieve, uh, I wish to reveal the root problems in the United Kingdom. What's causing us the problems that has resulted in the existential threat that we face economically, culturally, constitutionally? What's caused it? Reveal those problems without being divisive. I want to do it in a manner that just reveals the problems and at the same time offer up solutions. Will be a populist party in the sense that we're going to be calling out the establishment, standing against the establishment, fighting the establishment. But I'm not going to be divisive. I don't want disharmony in the United Kingdom. I want to call out problems uh, for what they are and reveal them for what they are. So I think, for example, and I will agree with you in this wholeheartedly, it's not helpful to constantly say the Pakistani rape gangs, because even though the majority of people perpetrating the rapes may be Pakistani, there is a danger in there that you basically categorize everyone who's Pakistani as a rapist. And that is not helpful for public discourse. It's certainly not helpful for identifying the root cause of the problem and then addressing it. What we need to know is, how did it happen? Why was it allowed to happen? What do we need to do to make sure it never happens again? And that can be done without inflaming people's sense of, identity or whatever. And so, yeah, does that make sense?
It does indeed. And I would just finally want to make the point that I think it is so important that we have uh, choice. That it's not just simply taken as a given that the Reform Party is going to romp home because of the personality of Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
There is a fundamental problem in the party political system, in that it's the personalities that lead sometimes, and many times are just glorified actors, and it's down to how effective they are as thespians as to whether they gain popular
Uh,
support.
Absolutely. And it's been the dumbing down of British politics. It's been the dumbing down of Western democracy, frankly, over the last 30 or 40 years, where the social media and other mechanisms by which you can hold forth have basically trumped actually understanding, intellect, execution capability, and so on. The really fundamental qualities that are needed to govern have been trumped by the ability to get on social media and talk shit, if you don't mind me saying so. And we've got to, one of the things I'm really keen on doing, if we can do it, is restore serious, principled politics. And it's not about me. You said I was the chosen one. It's not about me. If I succeed with Advance, my idea of success, and I think the only way Advance will succeed, frankly, is if Advance succeeds in creating a body of really capable people, great thinkers, fearless speakers, but people who know how to enact that which they wish to enact. Genuine doers rather than drum bangers.